My friends and I have always had a bit of a morbid curiosity for abandoned places, so when we heard about Randonautica, we didn't think twice before downloading the app. The idea of exploring random locations sounded fun, like a break from the usual routine, you know? It was a Saturday afternoon, and we were bored with nothing much to do. So we opened the app and let it choose our next destination. After generating a few coordinates without much luck, one landed in the middle of a busy road, and another seemed to be in someone's private yard. The app finally gave us something interesting. A spot deep in the mountains, unmarked on the map. We didn't really know what to expect, but the sense of adventure took over, and everyone in the car agreed to go check it out. The GPS guided us down a narrow road, surrounded by tall trees that almost blocked out the sunlight. It was a desolate yet fascinating landscape. After what felt like hours of driving, we arrived at our destination. An old cabin, seemingly forgotten by time. There was no sign of life, no one around. Everything was quiet, maybe too quiet. We stood there, staring at that building for a few minutes, unsure if we should explore it or not. The cabin wasn't on any map, and there were no signs that anyone had been there recently. It looked like it had been left behind, untouched, waiting for something or someone. One of my friends finally broke the silence. "Come on. It's not every day Randonautica brings you to a place like this." With nervous laughs, we decided to get out of the car. But we had no idea what that cabin was hiding. As we stepped out of the car and approached the cabin, something immediately caught our attention. It felt like time didn't move here. The wood of the cabin was worn, as if it had weathered decades of abandonment, but something felt off. The front door was oddly ajar, like it had been left open, waiting for us. We entered, hesitant, and the inside was even stranger. Everything seemed too organized. There was a table in the middle of the room, with plates, glasses, and silverware perfectly set, as if someone had just prepared for dinner. But the rest of the cabin was covered in dust. It was like time had stopped for that one corner of the room while the rest of the place decayed. I looked around, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. A bed with yellowed sheets sat in one corner, and the walls were covered with strange markings. Maybe symbols, but too faded to make out. My friends started exploring the other rooms, but we couldn't ignore that table, so out of place in the middle of all the decay. The plates, the glasses, they were clean. Not a speck of dust. Who had been here, and why did it look like they were waiting for us? Then I noticed something even more unsettling. The table was set for 4 people. Exactly the number of people in our group. The atmosphere grew heavy, as if the air inside the cabin was pressing down on us. Something was watching us, even if we couldn't see it. One of my friends whispered, "This is getting way too weird, man." Little did we know, this was just the beginning. As we tried to make sense of the bizarre scene, we heard a noise outside. It was subtle, almost like footsteps on dry leaves, but enough to freeze everyone in place. We looked at each other, trying to find some comfort in everyone else's reactions, but no one had an explanation. "You guys heard that, right?" I asked, trying to hide my growing fear. One of my friends went to the window, pulling back the dusty curtain, and I saw his face change. He turned pale. "Dude, there's someone outside." I went over to look too. There, among the trees, were fresh footprints in the damp ground, like someone had just walked by. The problem was, none of us had seen anyone arrive. It was as if those tracks had appeared out of nowhere, without a sound, without warning. Then we heard it again, this time clearer. Footsteps, getting closer. We started backing away inside the cabin, the silence turning into suffocating tension. My heart was racing, and as much as I wanted to believe it was just our imagination, everything pointed to the opposite. We were being watched, and worse followed. At that moment, every instinct screamed for us to get out of there. But before we could act, something crashed loudly outside the cabin. A branch? Or maybe something, or someone wanting us to know we weren't alone. Now it wasn't just about curiosity. The feeling of real danger was in the air, and we knew, somehow, that place was pulling us into something much darker than we had ever expected. No one could move. We stood there, paralyzed by fear, looking at each other, waiting for someone to suggest what to do. That's when one of my friends, trying to keep his panic in check, turned toward the door and said, "We need to get out of here, now." As he spoke, my eyes were drawn to something on the opposite wall of the cabin. There was an old cabinet, locked with a rusty padlock. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A small crumpled piece of paper, wedged into the padlock, like it had been placed there deliberately. Trembling, I walked over and grabbed the paper. As I unfolded it, I saw it was a simple message, handwritten in a rushed scrawl. "You shouldn't be here." I showed the note to the group, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Who had left that note? And more importantly, why was it still here after all this time? The strangest part was, even though the padlock was old and rusty, the cabinet looked used. Something inside me was screaming not to open it, but my morbid curiosity was impossible to resist. That's when another friend, unable to hold back, started forcing the lock. When he finally broke it and opened the cabinet, every fiber in my being told me this was a mistake. Inside, piled at the bottom, was a collection of objects that made no sense. Used candles, old photographs of people we didn't recognize, and a clock, still ticking, in the middle of the chaos, as if it was counting down to something. In that moment, everything became clear. This cabin wasn't just some abandoned place. It had been waiting for us, and whoever had brought us here knew exactly when we would arrive. The silence that settled after we opened the cabinet was thick, almost suffocating. No one could tear their eyes away from that clock, its ticking echoing in our ears like a countdown. But to what? We had no idea. The feeling that we were being watched grew stronger with each passing second, like something or someone was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Without thinking, one of my friends grabbed the clock and smashed it on the floor, shattering it into pieces. It was like that action had awakened something. Suddenly, the noises outside the cabin grew louder, more persistent. They weren't just footsteps anymore. It sounded like there were more than one person outside, surrounding the cabin. I looked at the door, every instinct screaming to get out of there, but I knew we couldn't just run blindly. That's when a loud scraping sound from outside froze us in terror. The figure my friend had seen earlier, standing between the trees, was now clearly moving around the cabin. This time I saw it with my own eyes. A tall, hooded figure, motionless but clearly watching us, waiting for something. That's when we realized we were trapped. If we left now, we'd have to pass by it, or them. Fear consumed all of us, and the sound of scratching on the cabin walls grew louder, like something was trying to get in. No one could pretend it was paranoia anymore. This was real, very real. Without thinking, we ran. Grabbing what we could, we bolted for the door, trying to ignore the presence around us. What I felt as we passed by the hooded figure is something I'll never be able to explain. It was as if the air around us was closing in, pushing us forward, forcing us to flee. I didn't look back. None of us did. When we finally reached the car, everyone was breathless, hearts racing. As soon as I started the engine and sped off, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. And that's when I saw it. The hooded figure, standing in the same spot, watching us as we disappeared into the darkness of the road. We left that cabin, but we were never the same. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed, or if that thing followed us home. It was a Sunday afternoon when my family and I decided to try out this thing called Randonautica. We had heard all sorts of bizarre stories about the app, but we figured it was just urban legends or exaggerations. You know how it is. People love to make things up on the internet. Still, we were curious and a bit bored, so we figured, why not give it a shot? After setting everything up, the app gave us coordinates that, surprisingly, were only a few miles from where we lived. The destination? a ghost town long abandoned, in the hills near our city. We'd heard of the place before but never had a reason to visit. It seemed like the perfect spot for an afternoon of exploration, a little family adventure, as we like to call it. We packed up the car and set off. The road to the ghost town was narrow and winding, flanked by ancient trees that seemed to hide long-forgotten secrets. As we got closer, the old buildings started to appear on the horizon, overgrown with vegetation and worn down by decades of neglect. Broken windows, doors ripped off their hinges, and collapsed roofs gave the place an even more desolate look. When we finally arrived, we got out of the car and began walking through the town. It was so quiet, an unsettling kind of quiet. There were no birds, no wind, just the occasional crunch of dry leaves under our feet. We stood there in the middle of a town frozen in time, and somehow it didn't feel right. But at that moment, I thought it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. Little did we know that feeling was the first sign something was about to happen. As we walked through the town, we started taking some pictures, just to capture the experience. The place had an eerie vibe, but at the same time, it was fascinating. I snapped photo after photo. Rusty old signs, crumbling facades, the setting sun casting a glow behind the abandoned structures. My sister was up ahead, exploring what looked like an old store. Then, out of curiosity, I decided to look through the photos I had taken so far. I was just scrolling through them, reviewing the images, when something caught my eye. In one of the photos, taken in front of an old two-story house, there was something, or rather, someone. In the corner of the image, almost unnoticeable at first, a figure was standing. It didn't look like a reflection or a camera glitch. It was a person, a silhouette like a man, and he was standing off in the distance between two trees. The most disturbing detail? He was looking directly at us. My heart started racing. I showed the photo to my family, and immediately the mood shifted. No one had seen this person while we were walking around, and we definitely hadn't noticed anyone nearby. "Who is that guy?" my mom asked, looking around, now clearly uncomfortable. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. We all started to feel uneasy, scanning the area, but there was no sign of anyone, which was strange because in the photo he was clearly there. But somehow he had disappeared. That's when the thought that something was wrong started to really sink in. I didn't know what to think, but something about that photo, that figure, made the entire trip stop being fun. We felt like we weren't alone, even though we couldn't see anyone. We tried to keep exploring, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. With every step, it was as if something was following us, even though we couldn't see anyone. My parents tried to act like nothing was happening, maybe to keep us from getting scared, but I could see on their faces that they were unsettled too. The tension kept building. My sister, who's always been the bravest, suddenly stopped and looked back. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The silence from before was broken by a sound. It was faint but unmistakable, footsteps, and they weren't ours. I looked to the side, and there he was, the figure, the same man I had seen in the photo. Now he was closer, standing between two abandoned buildings, half hidden in the shadows. A hood covered his face, but you could feel he was watching us, unmoving. My heart pounded, and for a second, I thought about screaming, but I couldn't. I pointed him out, but by the time my family looked, he was gone again. Just vanished, as if he'd never been there. That's when my mom said, "Enough, let's go." Her voice was firm, but I could hear the fear beneath the words. We started heading back to the car, trying to stay calm, but with each hurried step, it felt like the presence around us was becoming more real. It wasn't just paranoia anymore. He was following us. We knew, from that moment, this wasn't just a strange trip anymore. That thing was there, and it was playing with our nerves. Every noise, every shadow between the buildings felt like it was getting closer. We picked up the pace, trying to keep cool, but the sense that he was closing in was suffocating. We reached the car, and I quickly unlocked the doors. Everyone jumped in, and my dad started the engine with shaking hands. The car finally roared to life, and just as we were about to back up, my sister screamed, "There!" My heart raced even faster. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him again, this time standing right in the middle of the road, just a few feet from us. He was closer than ever, still motionless, with that hood covering his face and his body wrapped in a darkness that seemed to absorb the fading light. Without a second thought, my dad hit the gas, and I turned around, expecting to see him disappear like before. But this time he stayed there, standing, watching as we sped away. His face, or what I thought was his face, never appeared. It was like he was just a shadow, a figure with no shape. My heart was in my throat, but I didn't say anything. No one did, actually. The silence in the car was heavy, each of us trying to process what had just happened. We were all terrified, but no one wanted to admit it. As we sped away from that ghost town, the road felt longer than before. The trees lining the sides cast even darker shadows, and everything around us seemed threatening. Every turn, every dark stretch of road made my stomach churn. All I wanted was to get home and leave that behind. But then, out of nowhere, as we rounded a sharp bend, the car jolted like we had hit something in the road. My dad slammed on the brakes, and we all looked around, trying to figure out what had happened. In the middle of the road were broken branches and something else, something that hadn't been there before. And before we could react, my sister whispered, "He's back!" There he was, standing on the side of the road, just a few feet away from us, watching, waiting. No one in the car could breathe properly. It was as if time had stopped. The figure was there, standing at the edge of the road, and for the first time it seemed closer, almost within reach. Its shadow seemed to grow with the darkness, and my dad, pale, tried to stay calm, but we all knew things had spiraled out of control. It was closing in on us, first in the town, then on the road. Now it felt like it had us cornered. The car skidded slightly as my dad tried to maneuver around the branches, and the engine made a loud, choking sound. We all stared at the figure, waiting for it to move. But no, it just stood there, completely still, like it knew it had the upper hand, like we were the ones at its mercy. My dad floored the gas, desperate to get us out of there once and for all. The car lurched forward, bouncing over the branches with a loud scraping noise under the chassis. I couldn't help it. I looked back, expecting to see the figure vanish again. But this time it didn't disappear. In the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The figure, it was chasing us. It was fast, much faster than anything I'd ever seen. The dark form seemed to glide over the ground, closing the distance between us and it in a terrifyingly quick way. My sister screamed, and my dad floored it, making the car speed up as much as it could. But even then, it was catching up. Then suddenly it stopped. Just like that, the figure froze again, as if it had decided it had played with us enough. It stood there, motionless in the middle of the road, watching as the car sped away. Like it knew, even though we had escaped for now, this wasn't over. When we finally got home, no one said a word. The silence in the car was so heavy, it felt like we were carrying that fear with us, as if it had climbed into the car, too. We rushed inside, locking the doors and closing all the curtains, trying to shut out whatever that thing was. That night, none of us slept. And to this day, I can't stop wondering, did it follow us? Is that figure still watching us? Me and my friend, Jake, have always been the adventurous type. So when we heard about Randonautica, we knew we wouldn't be able to resist. An app that takes you to random places using coordinates generated by an algorithm? It sounded like the perfect recipe for an afternoon filled with laughs and, who knows, maybe something out of the ordinary. We were bored, with nothing else to do, so we decided to give it a shot. After opening the app and setting our intention to something strange, it took us to a spot deep in a forest about 30 minutes outside of town. Seemed a bit far, but you know how it is, our curiosity got the best of us. We put the address in the GPS, grabbed a few essentials, flashlights, some snacks, and of course our phones to document everything, and hit the road. The path leading there was winding, and as soon as we left the pavement, it turned into a dirt road, surrounded by tall, dense trees. The air got cooler as we drove, which was weird, since it was still early and the sun was high. After about 20 minutes down the trail, we arrived at the spot marked by the app. It was the start of a narrow path that led even deeper into the forest. Jake, always the more eager one, jumped out of the car first and started walking. I hesitated for a moment, Something about the place just felt off. But you don't want to be the scared one in the group, right? So I grabbed my flashlight, even though the sun was still up, and followed him. The first thing I noticed when we stepped onto the trail was the silence. There weren't any birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was a heavy silence, almost like the forest was holding its breath. As we walked further in, the silence got even more unsettling. I tried not to think about it, but it was hard to ignore. Jake kept walking ahead, carefree as always, but I felt every step grow heavier, like something invisible was watching us. Then we heard it for the first time. A low sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere ahead. Sounded like a voice. I stopped for a second, trying to figure out what it was. I looked at Jake, and he had stopped too, turning his head toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his tone less playful now. I nodded, my heart starting to race. It was definitely a voice. It sounded distant, but at the same time close enough for us to hear it clearly. The strangest part? It sounded like a child. A faint, almost whispering voice, saying something I couldn't quite make out. "Help," it seemed to say, but I wasn't sure. Jake looked at me, and I could tell he was trying not to freak out. "That doesn't make sense," he murmured. "A child? Out here in the middle of the forest." We stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to turn back, get in the car, and leave. But another part of me, the part that didn't want to admit I was scared, urged me to keep going. "Let's just check it out," I said, more to myself than to him. We kept following the trail, the sound of the voice getting a little clearer as we moved forward. With each step, the tension built. And then, through the trees, we saw something that made the air around us feel even heavier. There were toys scattered on the ground, old and torn, like they'd been left there a long time ago. Dirty stuffed animals, dolls with missing arms, and the most disturbing thing, a rope swing hanging from a tree, swaying slowly even though there was no wind. Something wasn't right. Nothing about this place felt right. The voice continued, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Jake, I think we should turn back," I said, but he was already walking toward the toys, too curious to stop. Jake approached the toys, and I stayed close behind him, gripping my flashlight tightly even though it was still daylight. The child's voice was clearer now, but still impossible to fully understand. It was like it was calling to us, but at the same time, distant, out of reach. "Look at this," Jake said, pointing to one of the toys. It was a plastic car with worn-out wheels and dirt all over it. But there was something strange. Around the toys, the ground was marked with footprints. Small footprints like a child's. Fresh footprints. "These prints, they're recent," I whispered, feeling my stomach twist. "This can't be. There's no way." Jake looked at me, and for the first time, I could see he was getting nervous too. But as always, he tried to play it off. "Maybe there's someone around here. Maybe it's just some kids messing around." He shrugged, but his voice was shakier than usual. Then the voice changed. What had been a distant whisper now sounded closer, more insistent. It wasn't just a cry for help anymore. It was like it was toying with us. A soft laugh, like a child playing hide and seek. But there was no one there. The forest was still empty. The swing, still swaying, seemed to move to the rhythm of a wind that didn't exist. Jake took a few more steps, looking around, and then he stopped abruptly. His face turned pale. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely audible, almost swallowed by fear. I looked in the direction he pointed, and for a brief second, I swear I saw something move between the trees. A quick shadow, small, like a child running, but it disappeared just as fast. Man, this can't be real, I said, trying to keep my cool. But the truth was, my entire body was on high alert. We stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The voice and the laughter continued, floating in the air like a twisted melody. And then came the worst part. Jake stepped back, and his foot hit something on the ground, a sharp, wooden clunk. When he looked down, he saw a symbol drawn in the dirt, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a circle with lines crossing through the middle, drawn with eerie precision, surrounded by small handprints, as if several children had knelt around it. "Is this some kind of ritual?" Jake asked, his voice barely holding together. Every instinct in me was screaming that we needed to get out. Now, the circle on the ground seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it was waiting for something or someone. Jake stood frozen, staring at the symbol with a pale face, unable to say a word. By then, I had no doubt. This wasn't a game. Everything inside me screamed that we needed to get out of there. Fast. "Jake, we need to go. Now," I whispered, but my voice trembled. He looked at me, still dazed, but he nodded. We turned to leave, trying not to look at the circle, the toys, the footprints. But that's when we heard it. The child's voice. This time, it was right behind us. It was clear, distinct, and growing closer, fast. A cold whisper in our ears, calling to us, begging for help. But there was something wrong with that voice. It didn't sound like a scared child. No, it was something much darker. With every step we took, the voice grew more intense, closer, until it started blending with laughter. A distorted, unsettling laugh. I glanced back, and that's when I saw it. Between the trees, in the thick darkness, a small figure was moving. It looked like a child, yes, but it wasn't walking. It was gliding across the ground, like it didn't need its feet to move. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. "Run!" I shouted without a second thought, and we ran. We ran as if our lives depended on it, because in that moment, I was sure they did. The toys, the swing, that circle, everything blurred past us, but the presence behind us didn't stop. I could feel it. Something was following us. The forest, which had once seemed empty, was now full of an invisible force, something hunting us, trapping us there. With every passing second, the sound of that voice and that laughter felt closer. Jake ran ahead of me, and suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. "What is it?" I asked, trying to catch my breath, but he didn't respond. I looked ahead, and there, in the middle of the path leading back to the car, there was something. A small wooden chair, one of those old-fashioned children's chairs, sat right in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there before. It was impossible. We would have seen it. Jake looked at me, unsure of what to do. That object seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in that time or that place. And hanging from the chair, a red ribbon swayed gently, as if someone had just tied it there. The laughter behind us stopped suddenly, as if it was waiting for our reaction. Jake and I stood frozen, staring at that chair in the middle of the trail. The air around us felt heavier, thicker, as if the very atmosphere was trying to stop us from leaving. The red ribbon moved slowly, like someone or something had just passed by. This wasn't here before," Jake muttered, his voice low and filled with fear. He took a step back, and I could see that he was just as terrified as I was. Then the voice returned, clearer and closer than ever. But this time it wasn't behind us. It was coming from all around. It was as if the entire forest was laughing, whispering, calling our names. It sounded like a child, but something about it was deeply wrong, distorted, almost inhuman. I felt panic surge through me. There was nowhere to run. We were surrounded by something we couldn't see, something that had been toying with us since the moment we arrived. "We need to get out of here now," I yelled, grabbing Jake by the jacket. He didn't hesitate. The two of us started sprinting down the trail as fast as our legs could carry us, not daring to look back. The laughter continued to echo through the trees, as if the forest itself was alive. With every step, I felt something closing in on us, like something invisible was following, ready to snatch us up. The weight of fear was crushing, and I could only think of one thing: reaching the car. When we finally saw the car up ahead, I almost didn't believe it. It seemed so far away, but at the same time, it was our only chance to escape. We ran to it, and I unlocked the doors with trembling hands. Jake jumped into the passenger seat, and I threw myself into the driver's seat, desperately trying to start the engine. Sputtered once, twice, and finally roared to life. I floored the gas, not caring about the branches scraping the sides of the car as we sped down the narrow trail. All I wanted was to get out of there. As the car accelerated, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and that's when I saw it. The figure, small and motionless, standing in the middle of the trail right where the chair had been. It was watching us, as if it was saying goodbye. And then, without moving, it vanished, disappearing into the darkness of the forest. The silence returned. No sound, no voices, just the hum of the engine and our heavy breathing as the car sped away. We didn't say a word the entire drive back. When we finally got home, Jake and I both knew we would never talk about it again. We knew that whatever it was, that thing, it was still out there in the forest waiting for the next person Randonautica decided to lead to it.